welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today we have our returning guest, Mr. Xiangyu. Welcome to the show, Xiangyu.
Good to be back as always.
Nice jacket. Nice. Is that a North Korean jacket?
Yeah, it's the 野战服 Yajeonbok.
Okay.
It's the one that Kim Jong-il wears, except his has breast pockets, mine doesn't.
Like that's not. It's not. Is it like a leader uniform? Only the leaders wear? No, everybody can get it.
It's like a worker's uniform. They they just wear it. It's this is pretty common. You actually see people walking around in these, and they also have summer suits and the renminfu or iminbok, which is their version of the zhongshanzhuang.
And that's made with like the North Korean made fabric, right? The special fabric.
Juche fiber, or as they call it elsewhere, vinylin.
Yeah. Right?
I think this is Juche fiber. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is.
Okay, so this is going to be very topical because today we're going to do the episode 0 of our Korean War series, but from the Chinese perspective. Because, often especially in U.S., the Korean War is told from the U.S. perspective, from the moment of U.S. involvement and so on. We're going to tell it from the other side. But to help people understand, the rationale for the Chinese involvement in the Korean War, we're going to go further back. We're going to go further back to the Japanese occupation era, to the history of a Korean resistance in China, and how they linked up with the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese national liberation movement. That will help you set the context for the ultimate Chinese intervention in Korean War. So to help me, I have Mr. Xiangyu, who had been to North Korea, as we talk about on our previous episode on Silk and Steel podcast with your tour manager Rowan, who took you there. So I highly recommend people to listen to that episode. And so Xiangyu, tell me why did you want to do this? Because you actually approached me to do this Korean War series. What was your rationale? Why did you think? Why did you want to do this?
I was watching that CCTV drama 跨国鸭绿江, and I was like, wow, this is some pretty cool history. And you're a Chinese history podcast, so that's basically my reasoning. Another reasoning is I think a lot of times when people talk about the Korean War, they talk about it from either, like you said, the US perspective or the Korean perspective. But honestly, the Korean War, you can see it as the Korean War, but see in China we call it 抗美援朝, the war to resist US imperialism and aid Korea. And it's seen as like a parallel war to the Korean War, because when it comes to the Korean War, you have different people with different perspectives saying, which side won, which side lost, how is it stalemate. But from the Chinese perspective, the goal of the war to resist US imperialism and aid Korea was simply to push the US away from the Chinese border back to where they were, and then just let the Koreans deal with their internal affair. So from that perspective, China did achieve its goal. So China did win the war to resist US imperialism and aid Korea, whereas it, depending on your perspective, you can say like North Korea won, you can say South Korea won. I don't know. There's more of a contention in that regard. And another thing is one of the reasons why I want to talk about this and do this series is because a lot of times people are just really hung up about who fired the first shot in 1950 and who was the aggressor and who invaded who, even though both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung both had plans to reunify Korea one way or another. But we want to go back further and talk about it as not just some sort of civil war that began randomly in 1950 or 1949 out of the blue, or even 1945, but a continuation of the struggle between the forces of national liberation and imperialism.
Right?
Yeah.
Between imperialism. And you actually have some personal connection, a family connection to Korea, right? I mean, like the Korean War actually affected your family.
Yeah, to a certain extent. So my dad was born in Korea, in South Korea, as like Hwagyo or Hwachao. So he wasn't a Korean citizen, even though he was born and raised in Korea, and he attended a Chinese school that was set up by the Ministry of Education in Taiwan, just because South Korea didn't recognize the children of Chinese men as their own. So then, and the KMT was also trying to do outreach and win over overseas Chinese. So that's where they kind of set up shop, and they kind of, people like my dad became adopted, like fake Taiwanese. They were adopted by the so-called Republic of China regime as citizens. And another thing is
so even though your grandmother, your father's mother was Korean, that was not enough to give your dad the Korean citizenship.
Oh no, and because of the discrimination my dad faced in South Korea, he kind of just downplays that side of the history. He's like, no, look at the family lineage. Okay, her family came from China 300 years ago. We're 100% Chinese. No, but actually, she did learn how to speak my grandfather's dialect after being married with him for so long. And since like I speak Chinese at home because my mom's Taiwanese, she spoke to me in Chinese, whereas she spoke to some of my cousins who spoke Korean at home in Korean. It was kind of weird. Yeah, she had like she has a Korean face, but she spoke she spoke Chinese like somebody from like the Jiaodong Peninsula in Shandong. Oh, my grandfather's older brother was in North Korea when the war started, because both of them were migrant workers from Shandong to the Northeast. And the Northeast is going to be a major part of today's episode. So you can kind of see like if you think about it if you just look at my father's side of the family, like my family background is pretty similar to so many northeastern Chinese people. They have like family who arrived there from Shandong because Shandong was poor, and the Japanese in the Northeast were hiring workers. And basically, my grandfather and his older brother moved to Korea. This was still when Korea was still a Japanese colony. And then at some point, my grandfather decided to move south, but this was before Korea was partitioned. But then 1945 came, and the peninsula was partitioned, so he couldn't go back north. And then when the Korean War started, the city where my grandfather's older brother was in got bombed completely by U.S. forces, or UN forces led by the U.S. So they went into hiding in a cave or whatever. And the Chinese People's Volunteers actually found them hiding. So it was like my grandfather's older brother's wife and his two kids. They were found by the People's Volunteers, and then the People's Volunteers told them Korea's dangerous, you should go back to China. So they went back to China, like on foot, from there to Shenyang, where they remain to this day.
And your family, your grandpa's side of the family didn't get in touch with his brother's side of the family until much later, right? Because of the Korean War and the Cold War.
Yeah, so what happened was my relatives in mainland China actually really wanted to reconnect, and luckily, I guess the Chinese community in South Korea kept pretty good records, and then they also kept pretty good records in mainland, like the mainland side of the family kept good records in mainland China, so then they matched up the records, and then like I don't know how they got in contact, but they got in contact first with my dad's oldest brother, my uncle. Yeah, but then my uncle died from cancer in 2004. So then for a while we didn't have any more contact until like a little bit more recently. Yeah, so I visited them last winter, or last winter, right before COVID hit.
You got lucky there. So we're gonna go dive into this very detailed history, but first we're gonna give you the historical background. So in the area of northeast China, what some refer to as Manchuria, much of that area used to be the homeland of the Manchus, which is the name Manchuria, where the name came from. But then in the 1600s, around 1644, the Manchus, they broke through the Great Wall. They conquered the rest of the China. They founded a new dynasty, the Qing dynasty. At that time, most of the Manchus actually moved to the south of the Great Wall. Many of them moved to Beijing because they actually emptied the inner city of Beijing to make room for all the Manchus coming in, and from that point on, the northeast, what's today's northeast China, or aka Manchuria, that whole area became very depopulated. Because then the Qing dynasty also implemented a ban on Han Chinese migration to Manchuria because they want to preserve their homeland, right? So they actually the Great Wall become kind of reverse. there's a different set of border wall that limits Han Chinese migration into Manchuria. So for hundreds of years, Manchuria became very depopulated. It's a lot of land, not too many people, and around at the end of 19th century, right there, both China and Korea were hitting hard times. A series of foreign invasions, famine, and that's when your ancestor, your paternal ancestors, starting to leave Shandong, right? Because Shandong is the Chinese province across the sea from Manchuria, and a lot of men in Shandong, they would they would do the so-called 闯关东, which they go beyond the Great Wall, go to Manchuria. Initially, it was against the imperial decree, but at the end of 19th century, because of encroachment of Tsarist Russia and also Japanese, the Qing government decided, okay, it's actually a good idea to have this place populated. So they start lifting the restrictions and let migrants come in. And the migrants actually come from different directions. So one direction is from China, from Hebei, Shandong, taking the railroad north. The other directions from Korean Peninsula. In the late 19th century, because of a series of famines hitting Korea, the Korean families start to flee across Yalu River to the north, and they found a lot of land, a lot of empty land in Manchuria, and they started to settle down there. In fact, Koreans are the ones who brought rice cultivation into Manchuria, because prior to that, crops planted in northeast China are like soybean, sorghum, millet, right? There's no rice planting there. The Koreans, because they were rice planting people, they brought their own rice, and they try different rice cultivation in northeast China. They had various degree of success because it's too cold. Manchuria is too cold for the normal rice strains, and until a Korean immigrant introduced a rice strain from Hokkaido, from Japan, because by this time Korea became a Japanese colony. This is in the immediate aftermath of the first Sino-Japanese War, which was actually fought between China and Japan over Korea, and after the Japanese victory, and very soon afterwards, followed by the Russo-Japanese War fought between Japan and Tsarist Russia, Japan gained complete control over Korean Peninsula, and they just dispensed with the last Korean dynasty, and they announced they formally annexed Korea and turned Korea into a colony.
Yeah, that was 1910, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which was the treaty that was signed between China and Japan when China lost the first Sino-Japanese War, was in 1895. And part of the conditions was ceding Taiwan to Japan. And the other part was China was obligated to recognize Korea's independence, because before Korea was like a vassal state of China.
Yeah,
And
Korea was part of the Chinese tributary system, but it's not the same. It's not the same vassal relationship that people understood in the West, because Korea still has its basically it's de facto independent. The king of Korea runs the Korean affairs, but they just have to acknowledge the Chinese emperor as a sovereign, and there's some they have to perform annual ceremonies when the Chinese envoy come, etc. And the tributary system also a lot of that is tied into the trade network. By acknowledging you are part of the Chinese tributary system means you now have trading privileges with China. You are not limited, you're not restricted, and you can send in your a lot of times this so-called tribute missions are in effect a trade mission in disguise, and you're also, it's not one way you send tribute to the Chinese court. The Chinese emperor also will send gift back, right? Sometimes even in excess amount of the tribute. So this was kind of the relationship. It's not exactly an equal relationship, but it's not the kind of the Western style vassal
it's not like
relationship.
colonization.
Yeah, exactly. And that was obviously not acceptable for Japan, because Japan after the Meiji Reformation in Japan adopted, basically decided to adopt Westernization wholesale, including the idea of colonialism and imperialism, and for Japan to expand, they expand to incorporate their immediate neighbor, which is first Okinawa, the kingdom of Ryukyu, or kingdom of Ryukyu in Okinawa, and then Korea, and then China, of course. So as the Japanese pressure was brought into Korea, a lot of the Korean migrants started going north, cross the Yalu River. And just to finish my rice story, because Dongbei Dami, the northeast rice in China now is famous, but it's famous because at first it was brought over by the Korean immigrants, and when the Japanese, after they defeated the Russians in this Russo-Japanese War, Japanese gained basically control over Southern Manchurian Railway and all the land around it. So Japan gained the port city of Dalian, and they gained the control of Southern Manchurian Railway, and a certain, I think, like 100 miles or like a certain amount of land all along the rail tracks. That became Japanese control, and then the Japanese South Manchurian Railway Company, they brought in their own agricultural experts, and they started to experiment with different rice grains, and they finally were able to get a certain type of rice from the northeast Japan, where the weather is colder, that's suitable to grow in Manchuria. And they encourage the Chinese and the Korean farmers to farm it. And so now that became so the northeast rice has maybe a history of about 100 years, but now they're famous all across China. And but it tastes very much like the Korean rice and the Japanese rice you can get in the Asian supermarket in US. So they do taste, the texture is much finer. So anyway, so that's just, I just wanted to talk about rice for a second. And as these Korean communities start to sprout up, the Qing Dynasty government basically they accepted them, but they asked them to convert into the Chinese nationality. This is the beginning of the Korean community in China, in Manchuria. And then around 1919, this is around the end of World War One. When all the powers were settled in Paris, to do the Versailles Treaty. something happened in Korea. That was the last king of Chosun dynasty of Korea passed away, and under very suspicious circumstances. Many Koreans believe he was poisoned by the Japanese. And the funeral was supposed to hold in March that year. And what happened was a March 1st movement in Korea in 1919. And it was a huge pro-independence movement. People wanted Japanese out, want Korea to declare independence again. And Japan brought in the army to crush this movement. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands were imprisoned. Many of these intellectual students, activists, escaped. They escaped to China. And that's where they formed a sort of Korean government in exile, trying to keep the idea of Korean independence alive. Now, aside from this group, there's continuous stream of Korean migrants still going to Manchuria, seeking a better life for more land. And among these are the family of Kim Il-sung. They came from Korea and they settled in China in the beginning of the century, the turn of the century. And so Kim Il-sung actually came to China at a very young age. And at those time that the Koreans were still the Korean community in Manchuria still live in like very insular communities, right? There's Korean settlement, there's the Han Chinese settlements, right? And later the Japanese brought their own settlers, or the Japanese settlers.
So Koreans in China, they're called like the descendants of these Koreans, like, so Koreans that have been in China for this amount of time, they're one of the minority nations in China, and they're called Chaoxianzu, or the Korean nation. And nowadays the relationships between them and the Han are among the best in China, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
But that wasn't always the case. Like in the past, especially during more difficult times when they were like when resources were scarce, there was competition for resources, and there was they didn't really get along. But that's really started to change around the time when the communists started resisting the Japanese. So it's a very this history doesn't just affect Korea, it also affects like so many things in China even to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I found a report by this group of Chinese communists written in 1923. It's a report on the conditions of Manchuria. And they stated that the relationship between the Korean community and the Han Chinese community were actually pretty tense because, the land disputes, because of different customs, different culture. And also around this time, because of increasing Japanese encroachment, Japan also kind of they initially leverage the Korean migration into Manchuria as sort of a proxy for their own expansion, because Korea itself was Japanese colony, and Japan, they claimed jurisdiction over these Koreans even though they went to China. And so that created a lot of tensions between these communities. And then, after Japan launched the Mukuden incident in 1931, that's when the Japanese Kwantung Army, who were stationed in Manchuria to guard the South Manchurian Railway, attacked the Chinese warlord Zhang Shiryang's warlord army to take full control over Manchuria. When that happened, first of all, a lot of the Northeast Army, the Northeast warlord army of Zhang Shiryang, they collapsed. They collapsed in the face of Japanese attack, and many of these deserters, they went into the Korean villages to loot. And so the relationship between Han Chinese and Korean community deteriorated after that. And on top of that, the Koreans, they were playing the Japanese were playing a divide and conquer strategy in Manchuria. So they set up like a kind of a different case system, so with the Japanese on the top, right? And the Koreans, because they were Japanese subject already, they're second class, and the Chinese were on the bottom, right? And so that created also a lot of resentment because the Japanese would employ Korean policemen, to patrol the Chinese cities. And this is a time when these Korean policemen, they will carry big sticks.
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, they carry like sticks, and they will beat people who are not following the rules. So that's when actually a derogatory term for Korean get coined around that time. They called them, think what?
高丽棒子.
Yeah, that means like Korean sticks, right? Because that.
Gaoli is the Chinese reading of Koryo, or like one of the older Korean dynasties. Koryo is the dynasty where the word Korea in English is derived.
Yeah, so there were a lot of communal tensions, and that term unfortunately became like later a derogatory term for Koreans. Gaoli Banzi. Don't use that if you're Chinese. It's
half of the Japanese police in the puppet state of Manchukuo or Manchukuo were in fact Koreans.
Yeah, and some of them served in the Imperial Japanese Army, in the Kwangtung Army, like the former South Korean dictator Park Chung-hee. Yeah, he was he served in the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria.
They declassified documents. Actually, they did a declassified document in South Korea a while back, and they found that 90% of the pre-1990 elite in South Korea had ties to collaborationist families or individuals. So it's not just Park Chung-hee. It's if you look at the military command in the South Korean army when the Korean War first started, like almost all of the top brass were did serve in the Imperial Japanese Army. Like a really great example, I guess we'll get into him more, was Colonel Kim Se-kwon, or Jin Shiyuan in Chinese. He went by his Japanese name Kaneyama Sakugen when he served the Japanese. He's like he's kind of seen as, in North Korea they see him as like Korea's Benedict Arnold. Yeah, super brutal. He was sent to kill and track down and kill Kim Il-sung.
Yeah, so what happened then was the increasing Japanese aggression, though. Now, like both Chinese and the Korean community were under pressure, right? So I already talked about first, there was already a class of intellectual students, activists who were fleeing Korea to all parts of China. They were forming the Korean government in exile, and then there were these a resistance cell started to form among the Korean community in Manchuria. This is the group that Kim Il-sung joined in his youth, and this was in 1930s, after the 1931 Mukden incident. What happened was the Manchurian warlord Zhang Shiryang, who previously controlled Manchuria with somewhat of a Japanese support, he had most of his men were actually not in Manchuria at the time. They were fighting in another Chinese Civil War. So he took his army, went south of the Great Wall. He was captured Beijing. So he was sitting in Beijing while this happened, and he misread the political situation in Japan because he had ties with Japanese government officials, and he understood correctly the Kwangtung Army initiative to take over Manchuria wasn't authorized from the top. So he thought this is just a diplomatic kerfuffle that he could smooth over with his buddies in the Japanese cabinet. But what he didn't realize is at this time, the Japanese civilian government completely lost control over Japanese military. And he ordered his troops not to resist the Japanese aggression, so not to give Japanese any diplomatic excuses. And that actually greatly helped the Kwangtung Army to take over whole of Manchuria. But while this was happening, in some part of Manchuria, especially in the northern Manchuria, some of his commanders, the warlord Zhang Shiryang's commander, did not agree with his no resistance to the Japanese command. So they started to kind of resist Japanese on their own. And this is the origin of like the 东北义勇军 or the Northeast Volunteer Army to resist Japan. But they were outmatched by the modernized Imperial Japanese Army. They were soon crushed, and there was a deal struck between them and Soviet Union to ship the remainder, about 40,000 men, through Soviet Union to Xinjiang. But a lot of men were left behind. So this was the point in the 1930s. This was the point when the Chinese Communist Party decided to activate themselves in Manchuria to organize a different resistance group. Because at this time there are these former soldiers, but also like farmers, who rose to resist the Japanese aggression. But a lot of these spontaneous organizations they're poorly organized. There was no coordinated joint effort. So the Communist Party, they decided to leverage this situation to organize all these different resistance groups to form into this one single united front called the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. And this they work also with Koreans, right? So one of the group they work with is the Kim Il-sung's Korean resistance group, and at the time, this is around the time when a lot of the Korean guerrilla fighters like Kim Il-sung, they actually joined the Chinese Communist Party, and they became part of the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army, the 东北抗日联军.
True that like 90% of the Chinese Communist Party members in the Manchuria area were in fact Koreans.
A high percentage of them were, yes, because they were highly motivated. Many of them in Manchuria because their family were fleeing the Japanese colonization in Korea, and many of them before coming to China were already anti-Japanese activists. So they didn't need much convincing, and there was. I haven't looked into this, but I just read somewhere the famous story of the eight women guerrilla who jump into the river to escape capture from the Japanese, the 八里投江. That is a famous story of the Northeast Anti-Japanese Resistance Army. That 8 women were actually Koreans, ethnic Koreans. I have to look into that claim. This is actually the first time I heard of it. But yeah, there were a lot of the Korean community gave support to these communist-led resistance. And Kim Il-sung himself, he actually led a raid into Korea itself, which at this time was unheard of, right? Because by 1930s, all the resistance in Korea has been effectively. Any open resistance have been effectively crushed, and suddenly there's popped up a guerrilla movement that attacked Japanese government installation inside Korea. So that was a big news, and Japan actually spent a good 10 years in Manchuria in anti-guerrilla campaigns, counterinsurgency, right? So this is way before General Petraeus in Iraq and Afghanistan. Japan was trying to stamp down the kind of the guerrilla movement in Manchuria, and they initially had a lot of trouble because Manchuria is huge, right? The whole area of Manchuria is probably about the size of Alaska, and they but then the Japanese at one point, and also the guerrillas they were receiving assistance from Soviet Union, right? Because through the commie intern, their connections, they can freely cross a border and receive material assistance from the Soviet Union, and because this was also the high tension between Soviet Union and Japan in 1930s all the way to I say early 40s. There were a series of border incidents between Japan and Soviet Union. Finally, culminated in the Battle of Nomonhan, and on the border of what is today between border of People's Republic of Mongolia and the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, and Japanese were decisively defeated, right? But then after 1937, Xiangyu, okay, so after 1937, what happened was that Japan launched full-scale invasion of the entire China. So the official start of the Sino-Japanese War was, for a while, was dated to 1937, July 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and because before that, Chiang Kai-shek's led nationalist government, KMT, has always been very accommodating. There have been series of war and battles since 1931, but Chiang Kai-shek keep on making concessions to the Japanese. And then in 1937, there was a Xi'an incident when Chiang Kai-shek went to Xi'an to supervise the extermination of the communist campaign. He was arrested by none other than Marshal Zhang Shiryang, who was a Manchurian warlord who lost Manchuria. And after he lost Manchuria, Chiang Kai-shek sent him to go fight the communists in Northwest, once killing two birds with one stone, right? He was hoping the communists and also the warlord force wear themselves out. And of course, Zhang Shiryang is aware of that, and then he actually formed alliance with the communists. He arrested Chiang Kai-shek. That was a Xi'an incident, forcing Chiang Kai-shek to agree to a united front against Japan. And this is then immediately after that, it was a Marco Polo Bridge incident, when Japan launched attack on Beijing, and that was a full outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And then Japan, they wanted to have a secure base in Manchuria, so they doubled their effort into their counterinsurgency effort. And so by 1940, they pretty much succeeded to stamp out a large-scale guerrilla movement in Manchuria. They actually drove a lot of these guerrillas across the border into Soviet Union. So that's when Kim Il-sung and his commander Zhou Baozong, they retreated with several thousand remainders of the Northeast anti-Japanese United Army. They retreated into Soviet Union, and they were reorganized by the Soviet into the 88th International Brigade. And then their job was basically training and also working on counterintelligence operations, helping to gather intelligence on Japanese Manchuria until 1945, because they were so the Soviet and the Japan, they signed a non-aggression pact in 1940 or 1941. I think 1941. That's when they signed a non-aggression pact after Japan was decisively defeated in their battle with Soviet Union. They decided, they're going to move south. They decided to adopt the Go South strategy. That's what led to the Pearl Harbor and Japan taking over Southeast Asia. So before they did that, they signed the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And during that time, the guerrilla movement ceased pretty much in Manchuria. But then there are those other Korean independence fighters that had fled to other part of China. One of them was Mu Chong, or Kim Mu Chong. He went to China in 1920s, and he went to one of the Baoding Military Academy. That's where he joined the Chinese Communist Party. And then he went to the Southern Chinese Communist base in Jiangxi to join Zhu De's army, and he participated in the Long March to the Northwest Communist base in Yan'an. And at the same time, there are a group of the Korean activists who were forming the Korean government in exile in China. They got the permission from Chiang Kai-shek to set up the Korean People's Volunteer Army, 朝鲜义勇队, and they were they asked for they formed a combat unit, and they asked Chiang Kai-shek's permission to join the battle. But before that happened, at this time, this was 1938. They formed this Korean Volunteer Army in Wuhan, 1938. But very soon afterwards, Imperial Japanese Army arrived in Wuhan. That was the Battle of Wuhan happened, so they had to relocate to even further South China, to Guilin. And in 1939, they regrouped. They formed another group. At this point, they were very impatient to get into the fight against the Japanese. So some of them took initiative into their own hand. They reached out to the communists. It's like, okay, well, like the communists are in the front. They're fighting the Japanese. That's where we want to go. And that's when the 朝鲜义勇队 split. Their leadership split, and the more radical group took their members and they went to the communist base. They went to the communist base in North China, and they joined the Korean communists who were already in Yan'an working with Mao. And these people, they renamed their they renamed themselves from 朝鲜义勇队 to 朝鲜义勇军, which I guess in English is still Korean People's Volunteer Army. And there was a famous photograph of one of their members painting the slogans on the wall in northern China in 1940s. I will dig up the photo, and the painting, the slogan says, the Korean and the Chinese people unite together to throw out the Japanese imperialists. And this core group of people, maybe around a few hundred, right? They participated in the kind of anti-Japanese resistance, because a lot of them speak multiple languages. They speak Korean, they speak Chinese, they speak Japanese, and they became very useful for doing propaganda to the Imperial Japanese Army soldiers. They were responsible to do a lot of broadcasts, to do a lot of slogan, and especially to propagandize to Korean soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army, right? Like, it's like, why are you fighting? Why are you fighting a war for Japan? And then 1945 rolls around. Soviet Union declared war against Japan in August 1945, and that was an August storm when Soviet Red Army launched a multi-pronged attack against the Japanese Guangdong Army in Manchuria. And they the 88th International Brigade, which consisted of the remainder of the Northeastern Resistance Army, including Kim Il-sung, they requested permission to participate in the fight. Initially, they were refused, but eventually, when as the Soviet Red Army pushed deeper into Manchuria, their wish was granted, because then they act as guides, because they know a lot of local conditions, to guide the Red Army to different villages and help with local administration. And so 1945, this is an area I'm not exactly sure what happened, because one group was allowed to go to North Korea. So this is a group with Kim Il-sung and his immediate followers. They went to Korea with the Red Army, to set up and help setting up the administration. But there's another group from who are the so-called the Yan'an faction, the people who have been fighting with a Mao's group in the Northwest base. They now also came to Manchuria with the Chinese Communist Army. As at the time of the Japanese surrender, Soviet Union took control of whole Manchuria. And at that time, the Chinese Communist Party decided to send in 100,000 men with their cadres into Manchuria to try to take over this region. And including in those 100,000 men were some of these Korean communists. And then the Korean communists started recruiting among Koreans in Manchuria. At this time, at 1945, I think there were somewhere between 2 to 3 million Koreans living in Manchuria at the time, and then the Mu Chong was allowed to go to North Korea, but half of the South Korea, half of the Korean volunteer army stayed in China. Half went to North Korea with Mu Chong, who joined the Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. But the half of the Korean volunteer army that remained, they actively recruited among ethnic Korean community in Manchuria, organizing them to join the local defense force, and eventually they absorb into the PLA. So during the Chinese Civil War, there were about somewhere between 30 to 40,000 ethnic Koreans in the PLA who fought in the Manchurian campaign in the Chinese Civil War. And they actually play a pivotal role because especially because these Korean communities and these Korean communists, their forces, they have no allegiance to Chiang Kai-shek, right? They have no reason to swear allegiance to Chiang Kai-shek. So, but during the handover, because the Soviet Red Army was obligated to leave Manchuria after a certain time, but at the time, the Chinese communists were entrenching themselves in Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek had the help of the United States to ship 500,000 men to Manchuria to take over. And initially, because Chiang Kai-shek was still legitimate, represents a legitimate government of China, right? They actually have a lot of legitimacy among like the Han Chinese populace because they're like, oh, okay, they're the real legitimate army.
It's amazing how quickly he fucked that up.
Yeah. I mean, August 15th, 1945, that was probably the peak of Chiang Kai-shek's prestige in China. He was seen as like the leader who, guided China through this very difficult period. From August to September, that whole few months, Chiang Kai-shek was at the top.
He went from 人见人爱 to 人见人爱.
Yeah, it's true. And then, the after the Chiang Kai-shek's KMT army into Manchuria, the communist forces in Manchuria entered into a very difficult period. They were pushed further and further north into northern Manchuria, except this small area in southern Manchuria near the Korean border, populated by Korean communities. That area was still under control of the Chinese communists, right? Because that's where they received most support. And then decision was made, they're going to defend that area. And instead of try to abandon it. So also kind of to give you an idea of the, I kind of wanted to talk about the Tonghua Riot because there was a lot of confusion in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese surrender, right? There's still millions of Japanese settlers, and plus, the former Imperial Japanese Army officers that would still remain in China, in Manchuria, and there was a huge effort to evacuate them, to send them back to Japan. Not 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 everybody got on board. Not everybody got on the ship and went back to Japan. There were still a lot of them around. So some of them stayed in Manchuria, and because many of them are have technical knowledge, because the Japanese they built a lot of factories and staffed it with Japanese engineers, and the Japanese hospital were run with Japanese medical personnel. Um, their role is it's hard to replace, right? So the communists decide to let them stay on in their position, and that became a problem when the Chinese Civil War broke out. And in Tonghua, this area of a lot of the Korean population, but also had a lot of these kind of remnant Japanese settlers in the Japanese Imperial Army. In 1940, since 1945 or 1946, the KMT basically made contact. The KMT spy network made contact with remnant Imperial Japanese officers in Tonghua, and told them, this is your chance to lead an uprising against the communists in Tang. And they did, and they started to storm all the government buildings and in the hospital, because all the Japanese doctors and Japanese medical staff control the entire hospital. They were killing the wounded of the Chinese communist communist soldiers in the hospital beds with like a surgeon's knife. So at that time, the Korean Volunteer Army actually played a huge role, because they arrived back in time in Tonghua, in a very timely fashion, and they put down the riot by the former Japanese Imperial Army officers, including them taking back the hospital, and they were and they made short work with them. I mean, like some people today, might call it war crimes, but those were special times. They just dug up they just dig a hole in the frozen river, and they dump all the captured former Japanese Imperial Army soldiers, officers who rioted, and dump into the river. But that they put down the so that is why in those this is give an example why in the Korean areas of Manchuria, the communists, they had more support, grassroots support from the local communities, and also they had advantage is they had North Korea as their as kind of like the ultimate backdoor, because when the KMT would send the army against a communist South Manchurian base, they will retreat into North Korea. and the KMT cannot pursue, without causing an international incident. And they will actually, a lot of the communist wounded, they would be treated in the field hospital inside North Korea. During this happened throughout the Chinese Civil War. That happened in Manchuria all the way till 1949. So there was a special relationship between kind of the Korean Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, right? And there's also a lot of interpersonal relationship, and like in fact, the composer of the People's Liberation Army anthem, 我们的队伍像太阳, that was composed by a Korean. He was this guy. His name, Chinese name is Zheng Chen. He was born Cheongbong Kun in actually what is now South Korea, in the South Jeolla province, and he moved to China in 1933, and then very soon he joined the Chinese Communist Party. He went to Yan'an in 1937, and while there in Yan'an, he composed this famous march song, which later became the march official anthem of the People's Liberation Army, and so there's kind of this tie between the you can say fraternal tie between the Korean Communist um, Party and the Chinese Communist Party that stretch all the way back. And
No, it's interesting you mentioned this
go
because
ahead.
it's interesting you mentioned this because so the area in Manchuria where all the Koreans like where it's like where it's mostly Koreans back then it was called Jiandao in Chinese or Gando in Korean. Nowadays it's called Yanbian and it's a autonomous Korean prefecture where Korean is actually an official language there. And I was actually there back in 2019, and there were actually these propaganda posters that read 革命老区礼仪延边, and which is like the old revolutionary site. And how would you say how would you translate 礼仪延边? It's like the 延边 of like the rituals or like proper.
礼义言边. Oh,
Yeah,
like Jesus. Like
it's hard to
yeah,
translate,
like
right?
I
Whatever.
mean,
It's basically saying Yanbian, this place, it's a site of like it's a historical site of revolution. This place is revolutionary. That's basically what it says.
yeah. It's a traditional base because that was a very important. Uh, that whole area was like the core area of the communist base in Manchuria during the Chinese Civil War in the southern Manchuria, because at that time there was the 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 KMT army basically pressed. There about 40,000 communist troops were kind of pressed into this four counties that was hugging the border of North Korea,
Along the
and they
Tumen
were
River.
facing they're about to be wiped out, and but because they border North Korea, when the KMT come, they just run. when the K, but then there was because there's also they kind of coordinated with the northern Manchurian base, which was commanded by Lin Biao, which is across the Songhua rivers. So when the KMT were go after these bases on Korean border, then Lin Biao will lead his army across the Songhua River to hit the KMT in the rear. So that way, like the KMT, they could never wipe out the communists. And it turns into a war of attrition. And which the KMT lost, so that whole area played a very important role in the Chinese Civil War, and that is why by 1950, as the Chinese Civil War drew to a close, Kim Il Sung in 1950 or 1949, Kim Il Sung actually approached Mao, and he asked Mao to send those Korean units in the PLA to North Korea, and like he said, these they already contributed to the Chinese Revolution, and we would need them, to help the Korean homeland. And Mao agreed, and then it was decided to transfer 3 divisions of these Korean units from PLA to North Korea. It's about, I think, total between 35,000 to 40,000 men. Uh, that actually bolstered greatly the strength of North Korean army, because prior to that, since 1945, Korea was divided between the Soviet zone and the U.S. occupied zone, and the original agreement was there was to be a united Korea with a referendum, right, across all of Korea. But in the end, the U.S. puppet government did not agree to it. They decided to form their own separate South Korean government in Southern Korea, and they actually suppressed the communists who wanted a united Korea.
They
And
wiped out all of the People's Communes too, and then they had a very rigged rigged election. I think we might go into it in the next episode in the series.
yeah,
I just need
yeah,
to get
yeah.
my notes ready. But if you look at the history, the South Korean government was founded, I believe, a month before the DPRK was founded, in on September 9th, 1948.
Yeah, this because before there was actually a brief lived was the People's Korea, right?
People's Republic of Korea, which was actually based in Seoul, but yeah, it was
Yeah,
overthrown.
and that was basically abolished on the effort of United States,
Yeah.
and U.S. also denied the referendum. They wanted their own man to run kind of their own U.S. occupied zone.
To Koreans, especially from the North Korean perspective, is the U.S. rule and like the military government of the U.S. in South Korea was a continuation of Japanese rule, and not just ideologically or whatever. But I mean, if you look at it, they made an announcement after just because to deal with the uprisings and stuff for the people, they declared that all laws that were in effect during the Japanese era would still be in effect, and then they put more laws on top of that. And then to govern the Koreans, what they did was they pretty much put everyone who was like a collaborator back into power, just because they knew how to run things over there. So
Yeah, and they brought in a lot of the people who were in collaboration with Japanese into the government structure, right?
yeah,
Like,
and then the people in North Korea who were collaborators escaped to the south because that was where they were safe. That's not to say that everyone who escaped south during the Korean War was a collaborator. A lot of them just didn't want to be bombed. But you
yeah,
had
but
like a lot of
yeah, and so from 1945 to 1950, this whole time, both sides were actually planning for unification of Korea, but on their own term, right? So even the South Korean leader, what's his name?
Syngman Rhee, Lee Cheng-wan, Lee Sung-man.
Yes. So Ri also wanted to unify Korea, but he actually enjoyed a little bit of a military edge over DPRK until Mao agreed to transfer 40,000 men from PLA to North Korea. So that actually tipped the balance. That bolstered the whole the total strength of DPRK army strength to about 100,000. So that actually materially, that kind of tipped the balance, so to speak, on the Korean Peninsula just before the outbreak of Korean War.
And even before so the Korean War, the actual fighting began on June 25th, 1950. But in 1949, I mean, there were skirmishes along the 38th parallel during this whole time. But Syngman Rhee in the south launched quite a few like small scale invasions into the north. They actually got pretty far. So I think it's kind of a pointless argument, in my opinion, to argue who shot the first shot on June 25th, 1950, because it was already at a boiling point. Someone was going to fire a first shot anyways. It wasn't like a matter of who invaded who. They're all Koreans. They all, it's just different forces. It's like the National Liberation Forces and the imperialist or collaborationist forces wanting to settle the score.
I mean, it's a civil war, right? It's a civil war. It's just like its nature is quite similar to the Chinese Civil War that just finished.
The
I mean,
invasion was when the U.S., which belongs on the other side of the Pacific, decided to join in and not just end it at the 38th parallel, but keep on pushing towards the Yalu River. And this is kind of a repeat in history because, as you can see, these imperialists, they don't want Korea for Korea. they want Korea because of its strategic location. It's always been used as a springboard into, the continental Asia, like China and the Soviet Union. Control of Korea meant you had access to those countries.
Even during this Chinese Civil War, there was a debate among the U.S. military and U.S. government on whether to intervene. The U.S. Navy was very gung ho about how U.S. should support Chiang Kai-shek because right after end of World War II, U.S. Navy actually made the Seventh Fleet actually made its headquarters in Qingdao, China. Right, so Seventh Fleet commanders were very gung ho about supporting Chiang Kai-shek and getting directly involved in the Chinese Civil War, but cooler heads prevail in the Truman administration and said, okay, like, no, we're not going to do that, right? And
they still got involved. They stopped the liberation of Taiwan.
Yeah, and yeah, we can talk. We will talk about that too, because the Korean War is going to affect the status of Taiwan in a very
Korean War
way.
saved the DPRK, but from the perspective of China, at the price of Taiwan.
You can see this as two concurrent civil war, right? There's a Chinese Civil War and there's the Korean Civil War. And both are sort of unfinished business.
Yes.
And this would all played out in a dramatic fashion in mid 1950. And I hope like this is just kind of a prelude to the war. And I kind of wanted to give people a little bit of a context of kind of the traditional relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Korean Communist Party, and kind of the Chinese resistance and the Korean resistance, and up to this point, it's the Chinese Communist Party and Korean Communist Party had always been very tight. They're like in their own struggles. So that's why when Kim Il-sung asked for that the Korean units to be transferred, Mao said yes, because they see all as they all see part of the kind of the communist movement, right, to liberate East Asia. So yeah. But so this is episode 0. In our next episode, which will be the episode 1, we will actually get into the war itself, the outbreak of Korean War and then the Chinese response.
And I just wanted to add something that I think everyone should think about is so a huge part of this the lead up to the Korean War was the fight against Japanese imperialism, right? Now, a lot of times we keep on hearing people say, "Oh, the North Korea is a dynasty rule, whatever." The power went from Kim Il Sung to Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong Un, and whatever. And that's their business. But at the end of the day, what does Kim Jong Un have to hide? He's like, what does he have to feel bad for? Oh, my grandfather, contributed to the fight for liberation against the Japanese invaders. He held the country together during the Korean War.
And it's also kind of teleological reading of history, right? It's like in 1950, like how, you are looking back 70 years later, look at the decision people were making back then. People back then in 1950, there's every reason for Mao's decision to support Kim Il-sung in his effort to unify Korea. I mean, like there's really there's really very little reason not to. And you have to look in the context of the time, right? Not looking back in 2020, because time changes. Circumstances changes. People are saying, oh, but look, North Korea, South Korea is doing so much better, but
not until quite recently.
South Korea actually didn't do so much better than North Korea until like 1970s. So it's all depends on from what time you look at. From 1960s, if we look at it from the point of 1960s, it's a success. DPRK is a much more successful model than South Korea. That kind of this is kind of how the time shift your perception. You can't only judge with the context of the time. Like, 10 years later down the road, it might be different again. Who knows? Like, it's like people look at China, mainland China in 1980s, right? When China just started opening and reform. And they might say, oh, like, look, they should have gone with Chiang Kai-shek. Look, Taiwan is much more developed, right? I mean, like, look at give it a few decades. Now look at 2021. China has done pretty well, right? I mean, so time changes.
Another thing about
changes.
the Chiang Kai-shek thing is it was because of the communist threat that Taiwan allowed his son Jiang Jingguo to do like a capitalist planned economy. Because
Yes.
what happened after the Civil War ended and Jiang Jingguo died, they pretty much forced Li Denghui, the then leader of Taiwan, to just completely liberalize the economy, and now it's been pretty stagnant. But I
Yeah.
mentioned the dynasty thing is because while we're looking at the Kims, let's look at Japan. Okay, look at who was the head of munitions in Manchuria during the 1930s when all of this was going down.
Yeah, the grandfather of former Japanese prime minister.
Yeah, the Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister Abe Shinzo's or Shinzo Abe's grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, or in Chinese, An Xinjie. He was the prime minister from 1957 to 1960, and you know what his nickname was?
Something of Manchuria.
Monster of Manchuria.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also who else? Who else? Prime Minister Aso Taro, who served from 2008 to 2009. Who was his grandfather? Yoshida Shigeru, who was a former prime minister whose family mining company. He was rich from like owning his family was rich from like mining, and they used thousands of Korean forced laborers as well as prisoners of war captured during World War II. So, I mean, why aren't we calling these people like? Why aren't we calling Japan a dynasty? I mean, it's pretty much it still carries on the same legacy. And the other thing is, note that these prime ministers and these former prime ministers, like the war criminals from World War II, they became prime minister in Japan after World War II. So that pretty much means like they did it under with U.S. approval. So what happened was the Japanese Empire had at that point effectively become a subsidiary of the U.S. Empire. It's like, okay, your empire no longer exists, but you have the talent of running empire, so you're going to do our bidding for us in the Asia Pacific.
Like I saw that picture internet meme on Twitter about this is what happened to the Nazis, and it shows all these Nazi scientists becoming the head of NASA, the Nazis general becoming the head of NATO, right? Like, but in Japan, it's even worse in Japan because there's not even kind of token effort of like the same parallel denazification that happened in Germany. There's nothing like that in nothing at that level in Japan, right? I mean, like a lot of since then, Japan has been run under the single party system, LDP, with like minor interruptions. And anytime like Japan is about to elect or do elect someone who voice kind of anti-American sentiment or socialist sentiment, like U.S. will engineer something and get him replaced, and this happens so many times. People don't even bat an eye. Like
the LDP wasn't that popular. It gained power because of a lot of U.S. funding and manipulation.
Yeah, and that has been to this day.
So I mean, if you think about it, you look at the DPRK. Why is it a single party? Why is there ironclad discipline? And are there limits to individual freedoms? Sure, but look at who they're up against. Look at all the power surrounding them. It's just one of them's poorer, so they don't have the money and the resources to make it look all pretty and to fit the sensitivities, tastes of Western liberals. While one of them, you look at Japan and the U.S. and what U.S. does in Japan and influences the politics. It's Japan is a dynastic power. It's a one-party system, just with disguises.
Yeah, and at this point, a lot of that is wrapped around kind of this fake concern about the Koreans, how they live their lives. But if you want to improve the Korean lives in Northern Korea, just lift the sanctions. That will immediately improve the livelihood by multiples. But you won't do that because you want a regime change.
If communism or socialism is just bound to fail, like as these propagandists say, then just lift the sanctions and let them fail on their own.
Exactly. I mean, that's very persuasive argument, but that's not the argument they make, and then they resort to some silly things. So, look how better off materially South Korea is than North Korea. Then it's like I say, it's all time. Time changes, things change. Like 1960s looks very different from like 2020, right? Who knows what's gonna happen in next 40, 50 years? We're not at the end of history, folks. This is not the end of history.
In the U.S., kind of when it comes to like in the 60s and 70s, back when it seemed like empire was standing on its last legs, what happened was when the socialist camp was bigger, the Western imperialists, the bankers or whatever, they knew they had to just give some concessions and let these countries develop. Otherwise, they would revolt. Like what did Kennedy say? Was it Kennedy? Like if we make the peaceful revolution impossible, then we make the violent revolution inevitable. That's pretty much code for saying we need to give concessions or there's going to be revolution.
Yeah, and that also happened to. They have to share power and wealth with the working class within the imperial core countries, right? And that's how, I mean, just think about it. For the people most of my audience who are, reside in the West and in the imperial core, we actually, got improvement in terms of welfare and workers' rights, benefits, and that because competition. Because of ideological competition, U.S. engaged in against Soviet Union, and you see what happened after the Soviet collapse in 1990. There has been continuous rollback and eroding of kind of the workers' negotiation power and the share in the pie. So. Yeah, so and the pendulum always swings from one way or other. Like we're definitely not at the end of history, folks. That's all I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think this is about an hour and 20 minutes. I guess we can wrap it up.
It's a pretty short episode for us.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry. So our series is going to be very, very long and very, very detailed. And because there's a lot to talk about, and I bet there's not even that much. I don't even know if there's any English podcast that covers Korean War from a Chinese perspective. So I'm pretty excited to be the first.
Yeah, and somebody out there like that series crossing the Yalu River. Like it's 40 episodes and they're like 45 minutes each, so it's like too long for me as an individual to do subtitles. But if somebody out there has the time to do it, please do it because it's a very good series and I think the audience would enjoy it. But I don't want to do. Oh, I know who can do it. Fucking the Bad China Jake Eberts. He does subtitles. We should make him do it.
The Bad China takes got a handle on Twitter. Oh my god. Okay, that's not a recommendation, by the way. Don't follow him. Or only if to laugh at him. That's okay.
He's gonna block you. I think he blockchained, but whatever.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you guys for listening and for watching. Until next time. Make sure you subscribe. Click likes, click subscribe if you're on YouTube, and subscribe to my audio-only podcast on Patreon, where I have more exclusive content. Also, I'm going to make my Taiwan series with Xiangyu fully public. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Bye bye.
흐르는 세월과 더불어 군복을 입고서 살았네.